Romans 14 Unplugged, Feasts and Fasts and Food, oh my, and we are in part 6. And last week we looked at this paragraph where we were examining the viewpoints of who are the weak in Romans chapter 14 from a traditional Christian perspective, and we borrowed the notes from a gentleman by the name of what is his name? D. Martin Lloyd Jones. Here we go, right there. And he wrote a commentary to Romans, and essentially he takes the opinion that the weak in faith that Paul talks about are basically Christians, whether they be Jews or Gentiles, but probably Jews more naturally, who are still holding on to vestiges of their heritage religion even after coming to faith in Jesus. So basically there are Messianic Jews, to include some Gentiles who are Christians, but primarily Messianic Jews, who still feel that it is required of them to keep the law of Moses, to keep kosher, to keep Sabbaths, and to avoid meat offered to idols. And generally speaking, these Messianic Jews don't feel that they have this freedom in their conscience to just kind of eat whatever they want now. They don't understand that that old dispensation has been done away with. That's the terminology that's popular in most Christian circles when describing the weak, which means before we look at this next one, which means that the weakness, that the identity of the weak in Romans 14 is commonly thought to be someone who it would be described as a Jew or keeping Jewish things. And so the description is labeled as in such a way as to define their weakness as a preference for keeping things related to Torah. So not only is the definition pointing to Jewish people or those who resemble Jewish people, but the reason for the label weakness is explained by most Christian commentaries to be a weakness that's tied to their opinion about the Torah and whether or not the Torah is still relevant for them today. So it's with that we look at tonight's additional Bible teacher. This is a very esteemed gentleman, well known in academic circles by the name of Douglas J. Moo. So let's look at his perspective, and we'll have time to read all of this. And then next week we'll start looking at who are the weak in faith from what I call Messianic perspectives, meaning people who hold to a view that the Torah is still relevant, how they define the word weak. It seems obvious to me that if you were a Messianic, whether Jewish or Gentile, meaning you see yourself as part of this Torah movement of today that is returning to the Hebraic lifestyle, you feel that we should be keeping Sabbath, kosher, festivals, things like that, and you believe that this is relevant for your everyday walk in Messiah, then how do you define this term weak, and why is the term weak given to these particular people in the book of Romans 14 and the letter? So let's look first at Douglas Moo's commentary. He says, I'm sorry, this is my own statement about Mr. Moo, and then we'll, Professor Moo, and then we'll look at his comments. Another well thought out opinion that I want to examine is that of Douglas J. Moo. He is a New Testament scholar who, after teaching for more than 20 years at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Illinois, has served as Blanchard Professor of New Testament at the Wheaton College Graduate School since 2000. According to Wikipedia, quote, he has published several theological works and commentaries on the Bible. Notable among them are An Introduction to the New Testament with D.A. Carson and Leon Morris, and the Epistle to the Romans, part of the International Commentary on the New Testament series. His current research interests are Romans, Pauline theology and exegesis, and environmental theology. He has been a member of the translation committee that produced the NIV and the TNIV since 1996, and is current chair. He previously edited Trinity Journal. In my estimation, Moo's understanding of this section of Paul's letter is nearly identical to that of Dr. Lloyd Jones that we looked at last week. So let's take a look now at Professor Moo's findings. And again, this is not to try to slam either of these authors or to denigrate them or look down on their research or anything like that. What I'm trying to do is provide one alternative way of seeing who the weak and the strong are. And right now we're examining the more popular views of who the weak are in this particular chapter of Romans chapter 14. Before I turn to what is arguably the minority opinion of who the weak are, and it's the opinion that I take. But first we're looking at the majority opinion. Okay, so Moo says, quote, a few scholars think that 14:1 through 15:13 continues Paul's outline of basic gospel demands. They note that his discussion parallels at many points what he says in 1 Corinthians 8 through chapters 10. And we looked at that, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago, I believe, where there are some obvious parallels, especially in the in the language and the admonitions and the warnings given to the groups at both cities, one at Corinth and one at Rome. So go back and listen to the what would be episode 83, I believe, if you're unsure. Moo continues, the parallels are obvious, but there are differences too. Moreover, most scholars agree that Paul writes 14:1 through 15:13, which is the immediate pericope, the immediate section in view, that he writes this particular section of his letter because he knows that the Roman church is divided. Now, Moo asks this question, why this church was divided is more difficult to determine, right? Why were they divided? He admits it's difficult. For Paul is not specific about the issues between the strong and the weak. And admittedly, yeah, he's kind of general, he's kind of vague in some parts of it. It would be nice if he would have just been a little bit more specific on what he's talking about. But there are some clues, and I think we can ascertain with a reasonable certainness, reasonable certainty what he's talking about. But Moo continues. He mentions debates about eating meat in 14:2 through 3 and 6, and we can compare that to 14:20 and 21. And Paul, he also talks about observing some kind of holy days in 14:5, and Paul alludes in passing to drinking wine in 14:21. But that's all. That's what Professor Moose mentions. He continues. Differences over these matters may have arisen for a number of different reasons. See bridging context section of his own commentary. Right? Moo continues. Most commentators conclude that the core of the dispute has to do with observance of the Jewish law. Right? That's essentially the basic standard Christian perspective. And I don't completely disagree with that. I do believe that much of the discussion in Romans 14 is related to elements of the law of Moshe, but there are some other aspects that are put in there that aren't directly related to the law of Moshe. In other words, they're not immediate commandments that you would find in the law of Moshe. All right, Moo continues. The weak were those mainly Jewish Christians. Notice he says right here who he believes the weak are. The weak were those mainly Jewish Christians, right? These are Messianic Jews who could not bring themselves to abandon the requirements of the law they had observed all their lives. Full stop. This is essentially the mainstream modern Christian historic perspective on this particular chapter. The weak were those mainly Jewish Christians, which means it included some Gentile Christians, but mainly Jewish Christians who couldn't bring themselves to abandon the requirements of the law they had observed all their lives, with the assumption behind this statement that they should have. Right? Even though Paul was a Jewish Christian, there's the assumption that Paul had in fact abandoned the requirements of the law that he'd observed all his life, that he in his strength in God and strength in Messiah, thus he's part of the strong, had come to understand that the law had been set aside, that it had run its course, that it had lived its usefulness, and that it was no longer a requirement for the people of God. And therefore this automatically placed him in the category of the strong, and these Gentile Christians who were brought into the relationship of God through Messiah never really had the baggage of the heritage religion of Judaism to contend with anyway, and therefore it was easy for them to adopt a law-free gospel, that is to say, a lifestyle that was free from the vestiges and requirements of the law that the Jewish people were observing. Because from these former pagans' perspective as Gentiles, keeping the Torah wasn't something they were brought up with by and large anyway. So therefore, it was very easy for them to receive a law-free message, if indeed that's what Paul was teaching. It would have been easy for them to hear Paul say, hey, you don't have to keep the law. And they would say, well, of course, hey, that's easy. We never kept it anyway. We don't have any familiarity with all of that Jewish stuff anyway. It was never part of our background. So, no problem. Just tell us what we need to do. All right, so let's continue. Moo continues. They could not, speaking of the Jewish Christians, right, those who were raised as religious Jews and then came to a knowledge of Messiah, thus they were Christians, but they were still Jews. These people could not, as Christians, simply ignore the food laws, Sabbath observance, and so on, right? And this has deeply disturbing implications for Messianic Jews who live in the 21st century, such as myself. But let's continue looking at Mu. The strong, by contrast, felt no need to observe these laws. Again, notice how it's easy to take the strong of Romans 14 in the first century and immediately identify with them here in the 21st century as a Gentile Christian who says, you know what? I don't have to keep any of the Torah. I wasn't raised with it. I wasn't brought up keeping Sabbath or keeping kosher. So now that I've come to a faith in Messiah, why should I suddenly go back under that? Why should I return to a life of Torah keeping? Isn't that going backwards instead of forward? Isn't that going under the law? That's not something I want to put myself through. So let's keep reading Mu's comments. Most of them still speaking now are speaking of Christians, but now speaking of the Gentiles. Most of them were undoubtedly Gentile Christians, although a few, like Paul himself, see the we in 15:1 were Jewish Christians. So again, Mu is saying that the strong and the weak were all Christians, but that the Gentile Christians had no hang up and hold up and no inclination to keep the Torah, and therefore it was easy for them to not have to think about even entertaining keeping the law, or the Sabbath wasn't special to them to begin with, so it wasn't one of those special days that they had to even consider. And the Gentile Christians, the Jewish Christians, they are the ones that would have had to that had to swallow this hard pill that Paul's trying to tell them, explain to them, hey, you guys need to stop doing all this stuff. All right, we'll interact with this particular viewpoint later on next week, but for now, let's just keep reading Mu. He concludes by saying, the weak condemn the strong for cavalierly dismissing God's laws. And let me pause and interject that isn't this so like the sentiments that Messianic Gentiles and Jews have towards one another, even in today's communities. We have Messianic Jews and Gentiles who return to keeping the Torah, telling their Christian Gentile counterparts who don't keep Torah, telling them, hey, you guys need to be keeping Sabbath and kosher and festivals and wearing tzitzit and things like that. And the Gentile Christians in traditional Christian churches who don't keep a Torah-based lifestyle, at least from the perspective of those in the Torah movement or the Messianic communities or the Hebraic roots movement, or whatever you want to call these people, these traditional Christians feel like they're being condemned by what should be labeled as the weak. Hey, these Gentile Christians of today would say, you guys are the weak ones. Why are you condemning us? Why are you condemning us for supposedly just dismissing God's laws cavalierly, right? We're the strong. We're not the weak. So you guys are the ones that need to step your game up. You guys are the ones that need to change your behavior. All right, so Mu says the weak in Romans 14, the Jewish Christians, they condemned the strong, which would have been the Gentile Christians, for cavalierly dismissing God's laws, while the strong poo-pooed the weak. I think it's interesting that this is an esteemed professor of theology, and these are his words. I didn't doctor them up. He says poo-pooed the weak, right? Okay. So Professor Mu says that the strong poo-pooed the weak, looking down on them for clinging to the old ways when the new had come. All right. He concludes by saying Paul sides with the strong on the basic issues involved, but his main concern is to get each group to stop criticizing the other and to accept each other in a spirit of love and unity. And I lifted Professor Mu's comments from, you can see my footnote number 9 here, Douglas J. Mu, the NIV Application Commentary to Romans, Zondervan EPUB edition 2009, section 55.13. Okay, and so with that, we'll call it quits for section 1. Next week, we'll be poised to begin looking at the alternative perspectives, who are the weak in faith from a Messianic perspective, and we'll begin to see that there is a different way to view this particular passage. And after looking at all the data, well, then you make your decision on your own, okay?